Hello again to another Agricola Reacts, and today we'll be watching KCTS9 History Making General Strike, because on the 6th February 1919 it was the first day of the 5-day Seattle General Strike. I never heard about it, so let's just watch. Let's see what was going on, what was the reason, why was it 5 days, why was it all 5 days, why wasn't more, why wasn't less. Let's just see.
World War I transformed Seattle from a provincial backwater
Really?
to a booming manufacturing center.
Well, yeah, it wasn't the...
Tens of thousands
It's on
of
the
workers
coast,
poured into
so-
Seattle, seeking jobs in its wartime shipyards and factories. Unions' ranks swelled.
1919, that's after the war.
During the war, the federal government imposed wage freezes on defense-related industries. Only the government's promise to raise wages at war's end kept shipyard workers from striking.
Okay.
But after the Great War ended in November of 1918, the government went back on its promise.
They were building ships to win the war, and they believed that their time had now come for a raise.
Yeah.
And the management of the shipyards basically said no. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
On January 21st, 1919, 35,000 shipyard workers walked out on
That's a
strike.
lot of people.
With no hope of replacing them all, the shipyards simply shut down. When employers refused to negotiate, the shipyard unions asked all of Seattle's 100 labor unions to strike in sympathy. Although there had been other
Why
labor
they had
actions
so
in
many
American history,
labor
the
unions?
idea of a general strike that would shut down an entire city was new.
It was the first time that a collection of labor unions got together, every worker in the city, and basically said, we are staying off the job until these particular concerns are addressed. Nothing like that had ever happened in America before 1919 in Seattle.
On the other side of the world, a wave of people's revolutions had shaken Europe,
True.
and some Seattleites feared the general strike was a call for rebellion.
The unions really misread how the battle for public opinion would go. They assumed that they could convince the public the strike would be good
Just go out
for
for
Seattle,
water
would bring
things down,
higher
high
wages,
cost of
but
living,
it really
justice,
fell apart
true.
right away when the
General
major
strike.
newspapers reacted with alarm to the idea of a general strike that would shut down the whole city.
And the language of those front page editorials is that,
Radicals wants to
working men
control
in
American
Seattle
labor.
were being
Okay.
led down a path by dangerous radicals, and that they were being deceived about the possible outcomes of the strike, that the strikers were un-American.
On the eve of the strike, the Union
Oh,
Record,
cause
Seattle's labor-owned
well, it kind of
paper,
makes sense,
featured
isn't
an
it?
editorial by Anna
Like if you
Louise
think
Strong.
about it, wasn't it that was just right after the revolution in Russia? Literally, like what, less than a year, probably, isn't it, or something like that? The whole thing changing into communism regime back then, and yeah, that makes sense why people would be afraid of that, because that was something new as well.
that heightened tensions.
It was probably the first example of viral content. It went all over the world. Anna Louise Strong was one of the real celebrities that came out of the general strike. She personified why the strike was important, and she was the loudest and most passionate advocate of its success. And she saw the general strike as truly a revolutionary cause.
We are undertaking the most tremendous move ever made by labor.
I'm sorry
in this
guys, I have
country.
to go back and
we
read
are
that little
undertaking-
article there on the
She saw the
side,
general
because
strike as truly a
I see
revolution.
polls, direct checks and polls to cease firing, peace conferences take hand in coal and railway dispute. Well, what's that about? What's the date on this? Tuesday, February 4th, 1919. Seattle Union. I'm gonna have to, God, trying to remember what was this about. You see? This part over here? I know that obviously the whole thing in Poland wasn't really settled yet. We did get our independence back in 1918, just in November, so February it's only like what, 3 months after. But yeah, there was still some kind of fights and stuff like that, and we actually were at war with Russia in 1920, so
Cause.
We are undertaking the most tremendous move ever made by labor in this
Sorry
country.
for changing the subject.
A move which will lead no one knows where. Labor will feed the people. Labor will care for the babies and the sick. Labor will preserve order.
She
True.
changed it into a drama. Us versus them, the workers versus the capitalists. Conservatives saw it as completely threatening. This was the Bolshevik Revolution right here in the United States.
That was really fresh as
General
well in
strike
everyone's
was not a revolutionary
mind,
strike.
so...
Very few of the workers who went on strike had any idea of producing a revolution.
It really was an
They didn't
attempt
want
to
it, they just
simply
wanted a
get
raise.
a bigger piece of the American pie for the people who worked in Seattle Industries.
As the strike date approached, worried Seattleites flocked to the stores to stock up on supplies. Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen realized public opinion had turned against the strike. He saw an opportunity to play on the public's fears of a
Thing in my
workers'
eyes.
revolution.
Ole Hansen was an opportunist of the first order. He inflated this for all it was worth and saw personal advantage probably right from the start.
It was to Hansen's best interest to make the strike as radical as it could be perceived.
Hansen warned citizens that a dangerous revolution was at hand. He deputized and armed hundreds of private citizens, including
Really?
many young students from the University of Washington. He sent them into the streets to enforce
Without any
order.
training, nothing like that. Just... Guys,
At
how many
dawn
people
on
died?
February 6th,
Because I
army
can't
trucks
see that
rumbled
happening
through the
without anyone
streets,
dying.
and machine guns were set up around the city.
For
Seattle
a
braced
strike?
for the worst.
The general strike had a tremendous potential for death and violence and anarchy
Yeah.
and mayhem of every sort.
65,000 workers failed to report to their jobs, and an ominous silence descended on the city.
This was
Well,
not
it's a lot of
typical
people not
strike
going to
with
work.
Angry picket lines and shouting and slogans and marching
Just
and
didn't
big
go.
crowds. It was literally
Just stay at home.
shutting down of the city.
Did they?
You
They
could
just
barely
stay home?
hear a sound. The streetcars weren't running, and workers stayed home. Nothing moved but the tide.
There you go.
The
That's a
eerie
very good way
silence
up to
bred
a strike.
rumors
That's what it
that
is,
the
isn't
mayor
it?
had been assassinated and buildings
What?
blown up. Fearing that the city could descend into chaos, labor organized a group of unarmed war veterans to help police the strikers. They patrolled the city, breaking up crowds and urging strikers to keep the peace.
The labor movement had planned very carefully for the strike, and their number one object and concern was we cannot have any violence, we cannot have any sense of disorder. And they
People
were
from the labor
completely
part, from
successful
the
at this.
labor
Perhaps the
unions,
most
they
interesting
had
feature
their
of the
head
general strike
in the right places, I
was
think.
actually the positive nature of the strike itself. The workers did not, in fact, violently cause chaos or disruption, and in fact, quite the opposite happened. The workers organized themselves to provide public services.
Large numbers of workers, mostly women, organized dining halls
There you go.
throughout the city and served meals 3 times a day to thousands of striking workers.
This was all sort of miraculous that this could be done in a city this size.
In spite of their
Um,
efforts,
I'm
the strike
surprised no
was
one talks
crumbling
about it
from
more
within.
often.
Everyday necessities were scarce, and strikers were feeling the pinch of lost wages. Hansen seized on labor's vulnerability. He threatened martial law. Police began making arrests, and strikers began to lose faith.
But what were they arresting for? Like, what was the cause for it? If they were
Under
peaceful,
siege
they
by the
didn't.
mayor, the strikers' resolve weakened.
The striking workers were suffering the same deprivations that all citizens of Seattle were during the general strike. They were finding it difficult to find food. They were finding it difficult to get around town on public transportation. They were as much impacted by the consequences of the strike as any citizen, so they gradually went back to work.
By noon on February 11th, strikers had returned to work, with little to show for their efforts. Wages did not go up. Anna Louise Strong was arrested and charged with sedition. Ole Hansen, however, became a celebrity known nationwide as the mayor who defeated Bolshevism. At the time, many regarded the general strike as a failure, but it has an enduring legacy, one that continues to shape Seattle to this day.
The Seattle General Strike is part of our historical DNA.
Showed a kind of grit and determination that has characterized Seattle for a long time, and I think we can be inspired by that.
Yeah, well, strikes like that can change a lot. See? Okay. Coming from being in Polish, obviously, I heard a lot about strikes of, let's say, 1970s and 1980s in Poland, 1980 strikes, I think, in... Guys, I wasn't work back then, so just have to remember, 1980 strikes in the shipyard in Gdańsk, obviously, was something that kind of changed our country altogether. So sometimes strikes can lead to really good things, and sometimes they lead to nothing. But I'm still very... They didn't mention any deaths or any people being very, like, injured or something like that, so I'm presuming that that strike in Seattle was really peaceful. It was very well organized, honestly. And yeah, they really organized themselves, like they feeding themselves and all that, so that's really nice to hear, because when I was kind of thinking 5-day Seattle general strike, I was thinking there would be something that I never heard about, some kind of blood loss and things like that, but no. It's actually admirable to hear about something like that. So, did you ever hear about it? Are you from Seattle and you know that history? Because like I said in the beginning, I never heard about that strike in Seattle. But I don't know much about Seattle in general. So, thank you very much for watching, and I see you tomorrow. Bye.